she calls the Tri-Counties Tippah Press and Alcorn. She was retired from the Department of Defense, and she was in the supporting equipment repair and maintenance, which she said she really loved. She's self-taught. She's a professional genealogist and continuing eagerly to use all the tools available to modern-day researchers. And she said this to me, and I didn't stop to really think about it. She considers herself fortunate to work at a time when she has endless information at her fingertips through the computer. When she began, she had to go to libraries and sit for hours looking at reels of records and old newspapers. And so we're really glad for her to come and talk to us, tell us about her experiences, and she and I can get the computer going. And this is Miss Shirley Cartwright McKenzie. She's going to come up here.
I'm so short though, I may have to just hold it and stand.
Okay,
to the
that's
side.
fine.
I want to thank you guys for having me come tonight and let me do the thing that I love the most. I would pay you to let me come talk about Cartwright. So he didn't really know when he said, "Oh, well, could we help you with the gas?" I'm like, "Heavens, no! Just let me come." I do have a special love for Tippah County, and it just evolved because I first started off deciding that what I was going to do many years ago, I was simply going to write down the names of all of my great-grandfather's descendants. And he was from Tippah County, and he and his wife had 12 children that lived to be adults. And they all got married and had kids, so that was the first thing that I was going to do. Well, needless to say, I never really got that done. I have been all over the world. I've been through Cartwrights, Moores, Wyndhams, you name it, I've met them. But I still haven't finished that list, but it doesn't really matter. So what I want to do is, I don't want to go too far away from my notes. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about the Cartwrights first. Our Cartwrights came into Tippah County by way of St. Mary's County, Maryland. The first Cartwright that came into the United States was Matthew Cartwright, and he came into St. Mary's County in 1671, and they actually said in his naturalization papers that he was born in a little place called Zeeland in Holland, or the Netherlands. And Zeeland, it turns out, is just a small island that's in the Netherlands. I have no idea why the Cartwrights were in the Netherlands, because it's a totally English name. So whether it was like religious reasons, or maybe they were just simply businessmen, I don't know. I will never do any international research, because guess what? I still got so much to do here in the homeland. So I'll leave that to other researchers to do. But they came into the United States, and for about 100 years, they lived in St. Mary's County. And then about the time of the Revolutionary War, which was almost 100 years after he came in, the grandson, who was also named Matthew, moved down to North Carolina. And they lived in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, and then later on in Halifax. But by that time, by the time of the Revolutionary War, this country, everything was on the move, and land was everything. And so Matthew's son went west to Blount County, Tennessee, which was then still Indian country and, really out in the wilderness. And he was there probably around 1800, and he died, though, rather young, and he and his wife, Mary, had 4 sons and 3 daughters. And this family then, shortly after, probably right after 1820, they had already started moving west. In 1830, they were in Lawrence County, Tennessee, but by 1835, they were living in Tippah. And being a genealogist, I have to tell you why I know that. See, you probably just say, well, that's fine, let's move on. But for me, it was really fascinating to see how could I figure out how these people got here. And so in 1850, when the census came out and it started giving the birthplace and the ages and so forth, then they had a son who was born in Mississippi in 1835, and his next older brother was born in 1833 in Tennessee. So I'm like, aha, my proof is there. They were in tax records. They lived up here, probably close to where Rogers Chapel is. They all lived together as a group at that time, and then it really was quite a good number of years before they started doing what everybody does, and everybody just sell land, move on. Okay, hit the down button. Okay, I've already covered this, so this is just the timeline from Maryland to Mississippi, and they arrived in 1835. Hit the down button. Okay. By 1860, there had been so many changes in this family. The two older brothers had already left Tippah County and moved to DeSoto County and had started farming there. The mother and the two brothers, the next oldest and the baby of the family, they had already died. So in 1860, really all that was left of this first core group who had come to Tippah County was my ancestor, whose name was Mary, her sister Nancy, and the widow of their brother, James Robertson Cartwright. And James Robertson I'm especially fond of their family because in the early days of my research, they stayed put. They all lived over at Dumas. And guess what? So did their kids and their grandkids. So it was always easy to find them, and they were kind of the core of my research, which is really one of the reasons that I finally got to where I was kind of Tippah focused. So by 1860, the family had already shrunk quite a bit. My ancestor was living over at a place called Silver Springs, and I have been searching for proof that Silver Springs was at the bottom of Silver Springs Hill. The Wikipedia internet sites have started placing it up on Highway 2, and of course, being a purist, I'm like, no, they can't do that. So I found someone who agrees that Silver Springs was down at the bottom of the hill. There was a coach stop. There was a stagecoach that ran from over at Jacinto. It came right across through the Hatchie Bottoms. It came up to Ripley, went over to Holly Springs, and then on into Memphis. So I heard you talking about having a sign put up, and I've got this dream in my mind. I'm like, I really do want a sign down for Silver Springs. So that's kind of the next thing, and I'm just announcing this tonight because Mr. Raymond Settles has already been drawn into my net. Everything I'm trying to do, I'm calling Raymond. So Raymond, be put on notice. So 1860. When they took the census in 1860, do you think that they imagined that just 1 year from then, their life was going to change and change forever? They really could not have had any idea. So there was just the women. James Thomas Asbury Cartwright, who was my great-grandfather, he had just married a Moore. He married a Moore. And he and his new wife were just starting their life off. And so that sets the stage then for the Cartwrights that I'm going to talk about. Now, Marks, when we first started talking, you know, he asked me if I would talk about a particular person who was the object of this conversation that I had had by email about John Harvey Cartwright. But when I began to think about John Harvey, then I realized that there were several Cartwright cousins who all served the CSA, and I really wanted to tell you about all of them. They are all very equally important, and they all came from Tippah County, and they all served with honor. Now, I'm going to tell you again, these are the parents. Mary Polly, who is my great-great-grandmother, her son, JTA, he was the only son that she had. And James Robertson was the cousin that I was talking about, that they stayed over in Dumas. His 3 oldest sons fought for the Confederacy. And then the baby, Thomas Jr., he had his 2 oldest boys, James H. and General Taylor, were the last 2 that I'm gonna talk about tonight. Okay. Now here are the cousins who went. Thomas O. was James Robertson's oldest son. They lived down at Dumas. The father was dead. Mother had a house full of kids, and I'm sure Thomas came home and announced that he was going to enlist. And I think about what she must have said to him. No. You're the man of the family. You know, we have crops. You're the oldest, you can't go. But Thomas was going to go. And so he enlisted in Company K, the Stubbs Rifles of the 23rd Mississippi Infantry. He enlisted in Ripley. Well, once the lock was broken, then his little brother Samuel decided that he would go as well. And actually Samuel went not too long after his brother Thomas went. He enlisted, in fact, he was so anxious, he went all the way down to Aritzabah to enlist. He couldn't wait until they came through Ripley. So he enlisted in Company B, the W.C. Faulkner Rifles of the 23rd. Now, the 3rd brother that I mentioned a while ago was John Harvey, but I'm going to skip him because John Harvey, he was kind of like, he's always kind of like been his own man. He did not enlist in the 23rd, so I wanted to include my ancestor. And when James Thomas Asbury enlisted, he left not only his mother and aunt, whom he had obviously been helping with the farm, but he left a wife and a baby. But go they did, so he enlisted in Company E. So all 3 of these cousins from Silver Springs and Dumas, they all enlisted within just a very short period of time of each other in the 23rd Mississippi Infantry. Oh, I just listed some of the battles that they fought in because I have to admit that when I got ready to start really putting together what I wanted to say tonight, I realized I just didn't know anything. I didn't know, I really, was just vaguely aware of the battles, and I knew the names, but I've never been smart enough to sort through all the details of how they actually went. And I've spent quite a lot of time reading, and I have to say that when I started writing down the battles, I was like, which can be more important? They were all very important. They were all brutal. We had brave men fighting in every one of them. And so they first went to Perryville. I think that was the first place that they actually saw any major fighting. And the sad thing is that the Kentucky battles, the Kentucky campaign was, I think, about in October and November. And then in January, Samuel, the middle brother, of the first group. He'd only been in the Army 8 months and he got measles and died. In fact, he died before he ever got paid. So I have a very kind of a special place in my heart for this young man who wanted to go because his brother went. And he was like so many other people that, you know, they had many, many deaths from disease and disease, really. People got sick from wounds, and they died, and many of them died before they ever got paid. The October campaign the Perryville was in October, Samuel died in January, and then just about 3 weeks later, my ancestor, James Thomas Asbury, was at Fort Donaldson when the 23rd fell to Ulysses S. Grant. And most of that regiment they were put on rail cars and they were sent north to prisons. There was one in Indianapolis. I happen to know it was listed that he was at Camp Douglas, which was in Chicago. In fact, there are quite a number of Tippah Countyans who died at Camp Douglas. On some of the websites where you see, you know, the people listed and where they died died at Camp Douglas. It was just like most prisoner of war camps. It was really a pretty terrible place. And the other, I think they had, they were there until the fall, and when they were reorganized and exchanged, probably at Vicksburg. And then as the war ground on, then they were in the Atlanta campaign. They were in the terrible Battle of Franklin. Then a couple of weeks later, they were at Nashville. So that was Thomas and Samuel and my great-grandfather, James Thomas Asbury. Now, I want to go back now. Now I want to talk about John Harvey. And this was the Tippah Countyan that me and Mark introduced, because the camp over in Corinth had written an article about a man named Willie Cartwright, who just, by the way, just died last year. He's the son of John Harvey, the son. I was so amazed that the son of a Civil War veteran was still living. And my daughter and I came to his 90th birthday party here a few years ago, and we were just like fluttering, you know, and they were just like. So they weren't nearly as impressed as I was, but I thought it was a pretty amazing thing. John Harvey Cartwright, I believe, was always kind of his own man. You notice he did join the 23rd. He joined the 3rd Mississippi, which was called Hardcastles. And I have to say that really took some reading. I mean, that unit, that regiment was like they had more than one name, you know, and I would try to read these records and it would be called something else. But we can see that they may have been called more than one thing, but they were at the battles that we always recognize and remember. They were at Shiloh. They were part of the Corinth campaign, and then he was also at Perryville and the Murfreesboro and Tullahoma. I didn't read nearly as much about those, but I couldn't even begin to list all the battles that these men were directly part of. And I just thought, you know, they walked from one place to another. They marched back and forth across this country in a way that I just find to be absolutely astonishing. I am just in awe of these people. So John Harvey, he was the only one that was in the 3rd Mississippi. And let's see. Oh, the other thing I wanted to tell you about John Harvey was he was only 15 when he enlisted. when I first did the arithmetic, you know, when I started writing about them, I would they enlisted in 1861, 1862, and I went back some when they were born, so they were like 15, 16, 20 or whatever. So I looked at him and I'm like, that's a mistake. The kid's only 15. So I went back and looked at the 1850 census and then at the 1860 census, and his age was very consistent. He was actually only 15. And so, see, he was the third of these three brothers, and I figured poor Elizabeth, by that time, they just, you know, by the time he decided to go, they had already broken her will. So he went. There's no indication in his military records that I could find where he was ever hospitalized or sick. He must have been a very fortunate person because it appears that he came through it without anything happening to him, like so many people, you know, would be injured and then maybe go to the hospital, and then you look at their muster records and they were back in their units. But he was a very fortunate man.
Miss Shirley, Mr. John there, his grandson Harvey is a good friend of mine from the Y.
Really?
And he told us that his dad, Mr. Willie, often told him that John, when he went to sign up for the war, was only 15, and he took his shoe off and wrote 18 on a piece of paper and put it in his shoe. And they asked him if he was over 18. He said, "Yeah, I'm over 18." So
I knew I liked him.
it was just amazing to me when you
Yes,
brought that up.
there you go.
I thought you might like to know.
I think that's very good. I mean, I just always thought, you know, everything, and when I tell you a little bit more about his life, and some of you may know about his life by knowing Willie and Harvey, but it's like everything about him was just different. I wish I had known him. Okay, give me the next one. Okay, these are the last two cousins that I'm going to tell you about. James H. Cartwright and General Taylor, who was his little brother. Their father was at Thomas Jr. that I mentioned earlier. And Thomas was dead shortly after, Thomas the father was dead shortly after 1850. And in 1858, their mother had remarried. So I kind of think that, you know, the family had shifted, and James H. enlisted in the, I didn't put it down there, but it was the Liberty Company. Anyway, when he enlisted at Ripley, he gave his residence as Silver Springs. And so what I believe happened was that James H. was living down in Silver Springs, not up in North Tippah with his mom and stepfather. And James H. had a sister named Mary Elizabeth, and her husband was a man named John J. Box. John J. Box. And John J. Box, who is David's, there you go. John J. Box, of course, was also in the Civil War. So he could have been living with his sister, or he could have been living with his aunts, or he could have been living even with his newly married cousin, JTA. So he was living in Silver Springs and enlisted. And I put the facts here. He's another, it's one of the sad stories. He mustered in 1862 in March, and the main body of the regiment was already in Virginia. And so they went east and joined up with the regiment. And he died of pneumonia then in June or July. So he didn't live very long. I wrote in some of my notes that he basically just, you know, he went from the farm to the grave. So it breaks my heart to think about these boys who walked away from their lives and were willing to give themselves, and he just died. There's one good thing I want to tell you that came out of my research, though. about James H. There was a hospital near Ashland, Virginia, where he died, and they had so many people dying, so many of the Confederate soldiers, that they started burying them right there. And so they developed a cemetery. And by the time the war was over, it was of considerable size, and there were local women who came out and they cleaned the cemetery and they tended the graves, and they wanted to honor those who were dead, and especially those who had died away from their families. And so the Woodland Confederacy Cemetery, you can find it online, and it looks like a beautiful place, and it's beautifully tended. And I found on the internet there was the Richmond camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans also, have a great deal to do with the maintenance of the Woodland Confederate Cemetery. So I sent them an email, and I told them that on behalf of my cousin, that I thanked them because he had been unknown for over 100 years, and that I thanked them for the courtesy and the service that they had done. Well, they emailed me back. They were glad that I was glad. So it was just I thought a really great connection, and I hope that they know how much that I do appreciate on behalf of my cousin who died so far away from home. Okay. Well, that's a nice one. Try one more. That other one was what I should be saying. Lots of blanks. Okay. Now, here's little General Taylor. Well, he dropped the general right away. You can imagine why Private Cartwright dropped the general from his name. But he's kind of an interesting one too. He's actually been a great mystery to me because his muster records said that he enlisted at Tone Hill, Georgia in December of 1862. And it also said that he was assigned to his company designation changed, and it said pioneer and dash sharpshooter. So naturally, I had to try to figure out what all that was, and I did a considerable amount of reading on that, and I found that the topic of the pioneer units was really a very fascinating one, because they took the cream of the crop and the best out of the units, and they put them over in these special units, and they had them do special jobs like engineers that would build roads. They had some of them that were sharpshooters. They had some of them, I think, that did a little work on the railroad. And none of that's ever written down, though. See, that's the bad news. So we really don't know that much about what happened to Taylor, because after he was designated as a pioneer, there are no more muster sheets. And yet there's no record that I can find anywhere where he was like a prisoner of war. I can't find him on any death rolls. So I don't know, they finally, some of the, maybe even in Richmond, they finally decided that they didn't want them.
I can get into that a little bit. He was actually at Tone Hill, Georgia in December 1863.
Yeah.
And came in right after the Battle of Tippah. Company E was there, and they were in the Battle of Missionary Hill. And which one of my ancestors there with Company F. But it was actually 63 instead of 62. Go, you 63 registered.
Oh, you're right. That's a typo. Thank you. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and so I don't really know what happened to Taylor. He never came home, as far as I can tell. I looked everywhere in civilian records, and it never really found anything that I could determine whatever happened to him. So I don't know if when he went, they broke up these groups and sent them back to their regular units, whether somehow the paperwork didn't follow him. I don't know. Did he get killed? I just don't know. I did make a note there. One of the interesting things that they said about his company was that during the Battle of Shiloh, they were not adequately armed, and so they kept them at Corinth and had them guard General Prentice, who had been captured up at Shiloh. And so I'm like, let's see. These guys they either didn't have guns or they didn't have bullets. What did they do? Watch these people with sticks? I don't know. Maybe they didn't need anything. But that is all of the cousins. These cousins all knew each other. They all lived in the same neighborhood. I wanted to tell you a little bit about each one of them and honor them. And I've really come to the end now, but I wanted to include this because when I was reading some of the sites that they have been posting this year, about the anniversary of the Civil War, or Shiloh, the Civil War, I found this site, and they were talking about the anguish of when the young men would leave to go to fight. And this was an entry by a man who was he kept a diary during the Civil War, and his name was John Houston Bills of Hardman County. And this is his entry: May 28, 1861. It's slightly cloudy this morning, but a pleasant day. Captain Polk's company of artillery gets off today. Several companies from Mississippi came through on the train. Immense crowds of both sexes are at the depot, and when our boys got off, the wail of grief from mothers, sisters, and wives of the departing soldiers beggars all description. All sympathized in the common grief. So that was really kind of it was the anguish of the beginning. But I wanted to include that because I hadn't really thought, you think about it going like one by one, but I hadn't really thought about the actual moment of departure. So that really touched me a lot. So now I'm going to just go a little bit through the end of the war and life afterwards. Okay. Spring and summer of 1865. Although General Lee had signed to surrender in April, some of the units were not actually disbanded until somewhat later. And now this is a review of all the cousins. Thomas O., the first to go, he came home. His brother Samuel had died in Kentucky. John Harvey was a veteran at only 19 years old. And my ancestor, James Thomas Asbury, when he got ready to come home, he went to DeSoto County because, and I want to tell you a little bit about that in just a minute. And James H. had died of pneumonia in Virginia, and Taylor, of course, we don't really have any idea what happened to him.
Now, which one is that, Dumas?
Thomas, Harvey, and Samuel all lived in Dumas.
I mean, buried.
John Harvey. He's actually buried in Payne's Chapel. But I mean, that's right there by Dumas.
John Harvey?
Uh-huh. He has a stone there. I feel kind of bad about Thomas, his brother, because we know he came home because in 1870, when they did the next census 5 years after the Civil War was over, then Thomas was living with John Harvey, and John Harvey had just gotten married, and they were farming down close to Dumas, and that's the last I ever saw of Thomas. I thought maybe he went to, Texas or went to Arkansas, and I have searched and searched, and there's no record, so I believe that he died. But it's really sad because he has no he has no stone, and I don't think he married, so he really doesn't have anybody to remember him. But he was living in Tippah County, and he did come home. And JTA, my ancestor, because they were living down at Silver Springs, and his wife was a mower. I'm sorry, I like to do that. Anyway, she survived him by many, many years, and she loved talking about the old days in the war. Now, she told a story, and I want to tell you, and I want somebody to tell me if you think this is really true. She said that about, and I think she thought it was about 1864, she said 40,000 Union troops camped in her front yard for 2 weeks. So I wondered, and I believe that I believe some were there, but I wondered if the number and the time didn't grow, with the passage of time. Because 40,000 Union troops down there in the Hatchie Bottoms for 2 weeks actually seemed like, I don't know.
I found a bunch of Civil War roads in there.
Did you really? Oh, I believe they went through there, because here's the thing, this was her story.
I know where Silver Spring went there from.
You know Silver Springs? Oh, you know Silver Springs. Oh, I'll have to latch on to it.
I can take you to Silver Springs.
I'm relentless about, I want to know about Silver
I
Springs.
got a guy that lives up there that tell you anything wrong. He can walk and tell you where it was going.
All right, I'm ready. See, right here in this room, I found more people that know about Silver Springs than I found on the internet in like 10 years, 15 years.
There's a guy that lives right there about 3/4 mile, I think.
Down at the bottom of the hill?
Bill Babel, before you take off, he lives on the main road, just before you take a right to go to Silver Spring.
Okay. Okay.
I have hunted back when I was a kid with an old man. We used to hunt in there, and his granddaddy showed him where Silver Spring was.
See?
We come out from Portland, go in there and drink spring still every day.
Okay, everybody, if you guys have emails, write them down to me, give them to me before I leave tonight. I need your email. Well, what my great-grandmother said was that they camped there, 2 weeks and blah, blah, blah. And she said that she went to, she went to get her grandchildren who were a short distance away at somebody's house, and when she came back, they had burned her house. And so she had 2 small children, and her husband was gone, and it was just, it was just the women. And so they went to relatives in DeSoto County. And the reason that I know that the core story must be true, is that when the war was over, JTA went to DeSoto County, and they actually lived in DeSoto County until around 1880. So they never came back to Silver Spring. So I believe that, that they burned her house, and that she was forced to leave. So, let's see. See what the next chart is. Okay, these are just a lot of facts that I tried to capture some of the bits of their life after the war. As I said, Thomas was with his brother in 1870. There's no record after that. JTA, his home had been burned, so he went to DeSoto County and lived there, and he died in 1884. He's buried in the Hines Chapel Methodist Church Cemetery in Horn Lake, although he never had a stone. But I have some cousins in Boonville who are daughters of the Confederacy, and they have a memorial stone that they actually put over at Carolina, which is where many of my Cartwrights are now buried. JTA's children, a number of them are buried there. Unfortunately, I've already seen at least 2 records that says that he's buried there, where people are like going there and walking in the cemetery, and they say he's buried there. But I mean, God knows where he is, and I know where he is, so I guess that's all that matters. John Harvey got married. John Harvey had an interesting son. He and his first wife, Mary Jane Medford, just had 1 child. I think she had real bad health most of her life, and they had a son named Isom. And Isom was what we would call autistic now, and he was a savant. He had very odd ways. He would not walk in a circle. Everything he did had to be in like squares. And if you moved his chair this far when when he was out of the room. When he came back, he knew and he moved it back. And but he had a brilliant mind for numbers. You could tell him the date of your birthday, and in just seconds, he could tell you the day of the week. That was just one of the peculiar things, you know, the way his mind worked. But he was never able to work, and he liked to walk the railroad tracks, and people were really mean to him. My father remembered him very well, and he lived in Corinth most of his life, and he and his mom are buried over in Holland. John Harvey moved, probably around 1900, he moved over around Winnesoga, over in Alcorn County, and lived over there really a good number of years. And his first wife died, and then he married a widow. And I've always kind of smiled because he went from having one son and a very quiet life, and the widow that he married had either 3 or 5 kids that she brought into the marriage. So John Harvey had a very lively life. And then I want you to, in case you can't read that, let me read this for you. He married Laura Joe sometime after 1911. She was 38, he was 74. He actually thought he was younger than that because when he gave his age in the census, he missed it by 3 years, but by that time he'd forgotten how to count the years. So they had 3 children, Laura Jane. They had a son named James who died in 1931, and then they had a little boy named Willie who was born when Harvey was 72, and Willie died last year. So sometime between 1920 and 1930, Laura died, and John Harvey married again. And this time, his wife was only, I think she was only, well, she wasn't quite half as young as he was. She was just slightly more than half. So John Harvey Cartwright was a very unusual, very vigorous man. He lived a very strong, good life. I wish I had known him. He died in 1938, and he is buried over Payne's Chapel, and he does have a CSA marker there. I've never been able to find out when he, like who got the marker for it. You know, I mean, I think the marker is a military marker. Anyway, he's the only one that has a marker. Okay.
I thought I'd let you know that the Florida camp has set up a scholarship for him. Is it Willie?
Yeah.
For Willie?
We got 2 scholarships, one for Willie, one.
They just gave it away the first time this year. I thought I'd let you share that with you.
That is really wonderful.
Willie Cartwright was a member of our camp, and also James Nams, and
They were cousins.
they were cousins. Both those were real sons.
Right.
He's the one you met.
I haven't met James Nels.
No,
He just-
Oh, Willie, yeah, Willie.
Yeah.
He was born
Yeah.
in 1866. Died in
Yeah, they were,
1957.
their fathers had kind of
About
similar
57.
stories, didn't they?
Yeah.
Mr. Nels, and in fact, one
My
time I
dad born
exchanged an
1907.
email with him, and somehow we just kind of fizzled out. I never really quite got back, you know,
My great-grandpa was
to
in
ever
the Civil
getting with
War.
him.
He was born in 1841.
I found this quote on a website, a man who's a descendant from the first Mississippi Cavalry, and this was on a website called Forgotten Mississippi Company Names. And he said, "I'll pass this history on to my children and grandchildren so they may understand the significance of the sacrifice of their forefathers who wore the gray with pride and honor, for a cause that we can only hope to grasp, but a glimpse of its meaning to their hearts and souls." Mr. Ed Ray. Thank you for letting me talk about my